It seems they've heard of you, Lois. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here. This is the kind of a return engagement for me because I had a wonderful interview with Lois Lowry many years ago for...
Louder.
They insisted that there. Is that working? Okay.
Is mine on?
Yes.
Okay.
I had a wonderful interview with Lois Lowry many years ago for a Boston Globe interview, a Boston Globe profile. So it's a great pleasure for me to get to see her again, and I know that you will enjoy her talk as well. A couple of several thanks that have to be expressed. One is to the great Avis Goldstein, who is here. This series was conceived by Avis, and she created the Harold and Avis Goldstein Trust a number of years ago. We've had many wonderful speakers, but as you know, the COVID pandemic has interrupted it, and we've not been able to do it since 2019. So it's a great pleasure to be able to do it again, and we are very grateful to Avis for that. We're also very grateful to Derby Academy, which has made this wonderful facility available to us for all of the previous events as well as this one. I don't think we could fit all of you in the little Witten room at the library. So this is just always great. And it's not just, their sound and light team and their parking. And so we're very grateful to the Derby family. They've been part of the town since 1784, and they want to remain, and they are very much connected with the community. So for them, we are very grateful. And also grateful to the library staff, Linda Harper and Anna Byrne and the library staff. This is a Hingham Library event, and we hope that you support your public library and use it. And so thank you to Linda and everyone else. I've done enough of these things to know that you have to say at the beginning, because you will forget if you don't, about the book signing. I know many of you have already purchased books, but for those of you who haven't had a chance to do that, the way this will work, there will be Ms. Lowry has agreed to sign books after the talk, and if you need to purchase a book, that will happen over here. The table over here will have books where you can purchase them, and she will be signing at the little table over to my left, and that will be after the talk. So that's how that's going to work. Now, I know you've all know about Lois Lowry. You all have heard of her. But I think there are many kinds of fame. For most of us, fame means, Taylor Swift, Tom Hanks, Barbie, That's what we mean by fame. But there's another kind of fame, a deeper kind of fame that is rooted in a lifelong career of creativity and achievement. And in Lois's case, it's rooted in a very deep and long-lasting, and I think very unusual for an author, long-lasting connection with her readers. She has always interacted with her readers, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And I can't tell you how many people have mentioned that to me. In fact, a library staff member just this past week said to me that her daughter, when she was little, wrote to Lois Lowry twice about one of her books, and she wrote back both times. So that kind of connection is part of her relationship with the young people of America and their parents. And she has written more than 50 books. I think she said 52, which is, I thought I'd read them all, but I guess I have some more work to do. And many of you know, perhaps her best-known book, The Giver, has sold 17 million books around the world. That is the first of a quartet, which you probably know as well, one of 4 books. And the other book that she wrote that won the John Newbery Medal is Number the Stars, and perhaps you know that one as well. That has been translated into many, many, many languages and is well known around the world as well. So this is a very unusual career. And I wanted to get to talking a little bit about some of these things. All right. This is, as you know, a book of some seriousness, but her books are not all serious. And the Anastasia Krupnik books and the Sam Krupnik books, Bless This Mouse that we were talking about earlier, the Willoughbys, Goonie Bird Green, and one picture book, Crow Call, which is also a wonderful book. The Birthday Ball is a book that I love. It's kind of a crazy romp with wonderful wordplay in it. But I think she has been most honored and celebrated for books for the middle range. Will you say 12 to 15? Would that be sort of a range?
Good. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Books for middle-aged readers, some of them with very adult themes. And sometimes, when I say adult, sometimes young people in them die. Sometimes even heroic characters die. But her career did not really have it didn't start with an explosive success. Here's her first book, published in 1977. And I wonder, Lois, would you tell us about this book, how and why it was written?
Yeah, this book, as David just said, was published in 1977. And some of you are good enough at math that you can immediately tell how many years ago that was. It's taking me longer. That would be,
48, I believe.
48. At any rate, a long time ago. Oh, I know.
46, math.
I do remember that I was 40 years old when it was published, and I'm now 86, so it's 46 years ago.
46.
At any rate, I had, like many writers, I majored in writing in college and went to Brown, majored in English and writing, and planned on writing the great American novel. Hadn't gotten around to it yet because and this was not unusual in the 1950s, I had married when I was 19 years old. And I had a baby when I was 21, a baby when I was 22, a baby when I was 24, a baby when I was 25. And I hadn't gotten around to writing my novel yet, but I had been, and as a matter of fact, when my then husband was at Harvard Law School, he agreed to babysit one night so that I could take a course at Harvard Extension, a writing course. And I just never found the time to do the assignments. And I was pregnant that year, as I almost always was. And my baby was born on October 15th. She has a birthday coming up. And when I missed 1 week of the weekly class, and when I went back the following week, the professor said, "Well, it's nice to see you've done something creative." I'm sure he meant to be funny, but it was kind of demoralizing. At any rate, something happened at that time. This is long before this book. I'm still in my 20s. I have these small children running around. And on December 7th, it happened to be Pearl Harbor Day, though that's not relevant to this story, but it was 1962, I got a telegram from my parents telling me that my sister had died. My sister was 3 years older than I. I was 26, and she was, at the time she died, had just turned 29. But it was my sister who taught me to read, and I'm the little one here. Sorry about the dirty feet. And my sister had just started first grade, and so she came home every day. I still, the photographs then were black and white, but I can tell you the color of everything in that picture because I remember it so vividly. But she would say, "Let's play school, I'll be the teacher," and she would teach me to read. But she would use the books that we had in our house, and we were so fortunate. My mother had been a kindergarten teacher before she married. We had a house full of children's books. My mother read to us all the time, And I had a retentive memory. I knew those stories so well. So when my sister explained to me how the letters had sounds and the sounds went together and made words, then I could look at a book that I already knew, and I could see that the word was the word that I knew from having heard the story so often. And it was not terribly long. I'm 3 years old here. Not very long after that I realized I could read. I don't think I told anybody that for a while. I remember my mother being surprised. I remember friends of my parents being at our house at that time. We lived in New York. And I guess maybe my mother had said, the little one knows how to read, and I had to prove it. They brought me a Saturday Evening Post. Does that still exist? Probably not. At any rate, turned to a random page, and I began reading whatever it said on the page, just to prove that my mother wasn't lying. But at any rate, my sister was my best friend, as sisters are, often my arch enemy. And here she is in high school, part of the May Queen's court. I was the scholarly one, and she was the pretty one. So there was a certain amount of rivalry and jealousness there. And then came this telegram telling me of her death. And my oldest child was a little girl who at that time would have been 5, maybe 4.5. And because my sister at that time lived in Texas and I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, my kids didn't know my sister. And I told my little girl about my sister when we were children and how she taught me to read and the games we played and the things we did, and worked my way up to why I was so sad because my sister had died. But my child, although she was a compassionate and intelligent little girl, got bored with that story, understandably, and wrestled herself off my lap to go and play. And I began to tell that story to myself. I think when something happens that we can't fully explain to ourselves, we tell it again and again, trying to make some sense of it. And so I told this story to myself over and over again until the time came, many years later, my kids had started school, the youngest finally went to kindergarten, and I went back to college and to graduate school, and so now I am 39 years old, and finally I have all those college degrees, and I even have a housekeeper. And finally I had time to sit down and do some writing, and that's when I wrote. I guess we don't need to go back to the cover of the book, but this book, which I did not have to simply send off to a publisher, because amazingly a publisher had contacted me, an editor from Houghton Mifflin in Boston, I lived in Maine, and said, "You sound like somebody who could write for young people." I had started by writing for magazines, and I'd also studied photography in graduate school. So I was able to do my own photographs to go with articles for magazines. And I had done something that was about a child. And this editor wrote me and said, "You sound like somebody who could write for young people. Would you consider writing," I don't know that they called them young adult books in those days, but a book for a young audience. And here I had this story in my head of the two sisters, and that's the one that I sat down to write. And I began it on the first page. Let me veer aside for a moment to explain something. Every time I start a book, and this is intuitive on my part, and I didn't think about it when I started this book or others, but I start with a character who's going to be the main character in a situation where something is not exactly right. And so the reader turns the page to find out how this is going to resolve itself. The first page of The Giver starts with, it was almost December and Jonas was beginning to be frightened. So you're introduced to a boy, soon you know how old he is, but you have this vague feeling of why is he frightened? When is she going to tell us that? And so I began this book with the two sisters. I changed the ages because they had asked me to write for a young audience. So the girls in the book are 13 and 15. It's from the point of view of the younger sister. And it begins with an episode, an incident that actually had happened. When my sister and I, sharing a bedroom, had had a fight, and she had taken a piece of chalk and drew a line across the rug and up the wall on both sides. And it says in the book, words I remembered from my own past. There, now be as much of a slob as you want to, but keep your stuff on that side of the room. This side is mine. And she divided the room in half. And so that's how I began this book. The two sisters competing with each other, loving each other, and then the one who becomes ill and who is gone by the end of the book. Now, that book was published in 1977 when I was 40 years old. It is amazingly still in print. And what did we decide? It was 43 years.
6,
40.
I believe the math teacher said.
And I still
46.
get letters, always from girls. Boys don't like this book. It's a girl book. And that's okay. But girls still read it, even though there is no, because of when it was written, there are no cell phones in it, there's no Wi-Fi in it, no internet. So it's kind of dated, but they don't care because feelings never become dated.
It is not dated, I would say. I
And
know what
in
you
fact-
mean in terms of its references, but not dated.
Kids still refer to, and some of you, if you're a teacher or a librarian, you probably know this, kids refer to this kind of book as a feelings book.
Well, the death of Molly in that book, the older sister, is handled with great restraint. The process of her, from the funny parts at the beginning with the line across the room to the saddest part, it's handled with great restraint. And yet nothing is left out. The details of what happens to the older sister are there, and the feelings of the younger sister, Meg, and the parents, which would seem to be almost unbearable, are handled with a great deal of restraint, but with a kind of a directness. And let me go on a little bit here.
Oh, you're going backwards.
Okay, now forward. All right. So there was Helen, and then in your own life, you lost your son, Gray,
Yeah.
who was an Air Force fighter pilot. He was a
Yeah.
major,
Yeah.
and he died in an accidental crash in Germany, 1995, I believe it was.
Yeah.
And in your memoir, looking back, you talk about realizing that you lost him at about the same. You were about the same age as your mother was
When she
Helen
lost
died.
her daughter. That's right. I'd forgotten that. Yes.
And you talk about imagining a conversation with your mother, who by this time had died.
Yes.
You talk
yeah.
about having a conversation with your mother. Can you tell us about that, what you imagined in
Oh
that
gosh,
conversation?
he didn't tell me he was going to ask me this, and I haven't reread this book in a long time, but I showed a picture, as I recall. It's a photographic memoir. There's a picture of my mother and probably a picture of me, and I point out that when she was whatever age it was,
I believe it was
her
56
first
or
child
58.
died.
Yeah.
And when I was that same age, Gray wasn't my first child, he was my second, but my son died. And so I talked about being able to talk to her if I could have.
You mentioned two moms in a kitchen over coffee,
Okay.
and how you talked about.
He's read it more recently than I. I must have fantasized about having a cup of coffee with my mom in the kitchen.
And you talked about asking her, how do I get through this?
How do you get through this? And of course, it's something that we all get through in some form or another. We all suffer grief in our years on this earth. But it was a way of processing that still, again, and I wrote that memoir many years later, but again, I was still going through that time. Of course, by then, it was after I'd lost my son.
Yes, right. Now, about your style, your writing style, your style to me is not a simple style, but it is an unadorned style. It's not a style that calls attention to itself. And I wonder, did you work on your style? Were you conscious in trying to develop it, and did you think it changed over time?
That's interesting. You know, I'd like to say that from the time I wrote my first book 40-some years ago, that I've grown and improved. But I think they're all pretty much the same in style. It's true that I studied writing in college, but I think I mostly, you know, we learn certain things mostly by studying literature, not by studying writing. But I think you know, most of it is by intuition. I do think if this is a time to go into that, I go about it the same way every time, although I've used a whole lot of, let me rephrase that. I've written a lot of different genres. I don't write the same book over again.
Right.
So I've written some books that are historical novels. I've written some that are set in the future. I've written lighthearted, humorous books, much more serious books, and yet they all do pretty much the same thing, looking at it from the point of view of the writer. I sit down, used to be at a typewriter. Remember carbon paper? Any of you old enough about that? And actually, it made me revise much less than I should have, because every time I wanted to change a paragraph, it meant retyping 100 pages. At any rate, and then The Giver was the first book I wrote on a computer. Oh. Now I've forgotten where I was going with that. But everyone, I would start out with that blank page, as you do, and with a vague idea in my mind and a character who has come to life in my imagination. I can see the character. Of course, first book I'm seeing myself, but then books that followed, a character appears, and it's new to me, but I know from the beginning who this character is, who this book will be about. Girl or boy, it's always going to be a young person. What age are they? What do they look like? And amazingly, what is their name? They come to me with a name. I don't know how that happens, and only once have I changed the name, and for a particular reason. And so there I am with a character and a vague feeling of what I want this book to convey. And so the character will have some sort of disconnection that has to be reconnected by the end of the book, and then the plot begins. Now, a lot of writers start out with index cards and outlines, and I know how to do that, but I can't make it work. If I sit down and write an outline, then I'm bored with it by the time I get to writing the book. So I start out not knowing how you're going to get from here to there. And that's the fun part for me. I've forgotten what your question was.
I think this is relevant.
But that's how I do it every time, even though the character in one book was a mouse named Hildegard. And in one book it's a dog. All the rest are human, but they're all facing something that they have to overcome by the end.
There is a calm, I would say, there is an assurance in the style, and to me, what the style says, even in books that are about things that are quite awful, and that have awful things in them, the style seems to say, keep going, we can get through this together. It seems to me that's the feeling I get from most of your books. Now, this is Lois's new book, published this year, The Winterby Puzzle. And it's really, this cover is a beautiful painting by the painter, the illustrator Jonathan Stroh, right? Well,
I never meet the illustrators.
Oh, too bad.
So, I know.
Maybe just as well, but he did this painting and the illustrations inside.
Can you open the book up, because the painting goes across? Yeah.
I guess you can't see the back.
Yeah. I don't know if you can see it from the audience, but it's a nice full two-page spread.
So you see this beautiful picture of these two young people. The one on the left, a boy with a stick in his hand. On the right, a girl with a mysterious spear and a shield. And a shield, and with an owl in the tree. This is a cover that makes you want to turn to page 1. It's really a very unusual book, remarkable book that I strongly recommend to you if you haven't purchased it. And it's sort of three things in one. It's a history, It is fiction, and it's also a kind of a set of reflections on storytelling. And the story just very briefly, a body was found in a bog in 1952 in Germany, northern Germany.
This is true, what he's saying.
This is the history part of it, which is at the beginning of the book, in a place called Windeby in Germany. And it was remarkably preserved, as bodies in bogs frequently are. They have been found all over Europe. This one, the upper part, arms and legs and the upper torsion head were quite well preserved. The middle part is sort of skeletal remains. And scientists decided this was a girl of about early teens, maybe 15 or so.
Nope, 13.
13. 13. And she was actually known as the Windeby girl for a long time. And then over a period of time, I don't know how much longer this was, it was determined that no, actually, it's not a girl. Actually, it's a boy.
16-year-old boy.
A 16-year-old boy. So what Lois has done is she tells this history, this real-life history, and then there are two fictions. The story of the 13-year-old girl, whose name is Estreld, and then separately, a story of the 16-year-old boy, whose name is Varric, and about what brings them to the bog, you might say, what brings them to their end.
Can I just interject something?
Of course you may.
Many of these bodies, called bog bodies, have been found in Northern Europe, well preserved. But all of them, till that time, had some indication of why and how they had died. There'd be a rope around the neck, stab wounds, head bashed in with a club.
Yeah.
Yet this girl, or boy, had no injuries, no visible injuries. So there was no information about what had caused her death, why was she dead in a bog. And also, she had been carbon dated, and she was from the 1st century. So that body was 2,000 years old.
2,000 years old. Well, I wanted to ask Lois if she would read a few paragraphs from the early part of that book, from the historic part of it, history part of it, because it tells a bit about, well, the story and about storytelling and the way in which life and experience can stimulate the imagination.
Did we include in the photographs the full body picture? You want to show that?
It's toward the end.
Okay.
We will
No,
come back.
in that case, you don't need to go past it.
You can see my marks where I indicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, okay. So this book describes at the beginning the finding of this body in 1952. And it says they called her Windeby Girl, which is what they did. They call each of these bodies by the name of the place they're found. So there's Toland Man, something or other woman, and this was Windeby Girl. Then it goes on to say this: each of us has a story. I do, you do, my mailman does, so does the frail elderly neighbor, the woman who waits on me at the supermarket, and the boy who just rode past me on a bicycle. Our stories, yours and mine, each have a beginning, middle, and eventually an ending. We have adventures along the way. We have moments of anger and despair, times we're bored and distracted, spells of quiet contentment, and other times when we are overwhelmed by joy. We live out our stories in various locations. Some of us perhaps end where we start, without ever having explored other realms. Others find it hard to stay put. Me, I was born on a tropical island. I moved later to a big city, then to a small town, then to another city in a different country, then to another, and another. I had siblings. Along the way, I was educated. Eventually, I married, had 4 children. I lived in different kinds of homes. Different kinds of houses. Big ones, small ones, old ones, new ones. I had dogs and cats, several horses along the way, and once, very briefly, a pet raccoon. A bicycle, another bicycle, and cars and more. I went back again for more education. I've told you about that. I chose a career. My children grew up. One died. I loved and I was loved. And I grew old. those facts are not particularly interesting. But when I embellish them with the details that surround each fact and what those details meant, how important they were, then the story is filled out and raises questions and takes on meaning, and the story gradually becomes me. And part of the me is a storyteller. I like to pry open doors, peer into corners, and figure out all the whys that make people who they are. So that's what I tried to do with this book, to figure out the why of this young, and we should have mentioned, and you'll see later when you see a picture of the body, that she had very blonde hair, but only on one side of her head. The hair was gone from the other side. So you begin to perceive, as I create the story, who she was, what it was like when and where she lived, and why she died at 13 in a peat bog.
And was it the fact that there were two versions? I mean, were you intrigued by the fact that there were two possible understandings of this story? Was that what attracted you?
Let me back up a minute. I began this, I read an article about this body, and I don't remember what I read it in a magazine someplace. And the instant I read 13-year-old girl, I thought, oh, those are my people. That's my audience. Those are the people who interest me. And so I began to think of this story. And I should add, it was 2020. My husband was in the hospital with COVID, and he was hospitalized for 84 days. Oh. So I was alone, and the library was closed because of COVID. And so I started doing research online. I needed to give her a name because I need my character to have a name. And as I've told you, the name comes in my imagination, but not a name that would have existed in the first century in Germany. So I went to the internet. Old German names, female. And there's a list, and I chose one. And then I began to research, and I discovered that online you can go to the British Museum, and then you can go around into the room where they have artifacts from the first century in Germany. So I found a lot of stuff, and I was so excited that I began writing this story. If I had continued my original reading, I would have found that 20 years later they discovered it was a boy. So I didn't know that right away until I was already in the story, had already determined in my mind how and why she would die. And I didn't want to let go of that story, so I kept it. And then I wrote the story of the 16-year-old boy and included it later and gave him an old German name from the list of boys.
It's a wonderful book.
I just got to tell you a little trivial thing. When this book was about to be published, it wasn't yet, but I'd seen the cover, I posted a picture of the cover on Facebook. Okay, we all hate Facebook, but some of us still do it. And there were a lot of comments, and one of the comments came from the anthropologist who had discovered that the body was a boy.
Oh. Do you recall his comment?
Well, it was a kind of surprise. It was a woman. And with a kind of unusual name, so I recognized the name. And she said, "Is this the same Windaby body that?" And I wrote back, "Yes." And I said, "If you send me your address privately, I'll send you a copy." But I never heard from her. Maybe she went to a bookstore.
She probably got the book. You know, my favorite of your books, I haven't said this before, but my favorite of your books really is not one of the most celebrated or famous one. It's The Silent Boy, which is a story, really a wonderful book. Again, one I would recommend.
Now, if you had told me that in advance, I could have given you a picture of the cover. Oh, okay, I did.
It's a book about. This is a book that works wonderfully for young people, but it also works very well for adult readers. And it also has, Lois uses pictures, old pictures in this story in a very creative and in a moving way. Some of them are pictures, old pictures from her own family, but a lot of them are pictures that you've got in
Most of them I found at an antique store in New
So
Hampshire.
she doesn't know who the people are.
Yeah.
But she pairs it matches them chapter by chapter with the characters. Takes place in about an 8 and 9-year-old girl, and it takes place in about 1910, over 1910 and 1911, in a town in, I'm guessing,
Pennsylvania, the town where my mother grew up.
And it's a rural area, farms and also town, so it's sort of a town-country setting. And the little girl's father, the little girl's name is Katie, and she's 8 years old, turns 9 in the course of the book. Her father is the town doctor.
Correction, she's 6, she turns 7. She's very young. and the reason I mention this, because at the very beginning of the book, I point out, it's the voice of the woman telling the story, and it says, this is about a child, but it is not a story for young children. And I did that because I didn't want people to pick up a book and say, oh, it's about a 7-year-old, here, I'll give it to Betsy for her birthday, and it isn't a story for 7-year-olds.
But it does work well for that 12 to 15
Yes,
age,
yes.
maybe even a little
Yeah.
old. But as I say, for adult readers, it's also a wonderful book. And so there's a little bit of it I wanted to ask you to read. And I did, when I mentioned this to her a little earlier,
I haven't reread
she
this
said she
book
hadn't
in a
read it.
long time.
But I marked a couple of, this first part here, okay, which is on page 1, through to where it says,
Okay.
and then also on page 4, again marked in pencil.
Okay.
And this is a library book. Linda, I'll erase the pencil
She
marks.
had pencil marks. Didn't your mother tell you never to do that in a library book?
Very light, very light. Hope you can see it.
Okay, and this has a date of June 1987. And it says, I am a very old woman now. My great-grandchildren, who call me Docky, a name my youngest patients gave me years ago, ask me to tell them stories, and I make up tales about talking pigs with pink hair ribbons on their curly tails, or monkeys who wear vests and carry canes. I am as good at foolishness as I once was in the operating room. If I tried to tell them this story, the one I'm about to set down here, their parents would send me warning looks over the heads of the children. Don't, the looks would say, stop. Meaning, too depressing, too complicated, too long ago. And now page 4.
Yeah.
Okay. At 8, this is still the narrator talking. At 8, I had heard of the terrible fire in New York, of the factory girls, scores of them leaping from the windows, their clothes aflame and dying, burned and mangled on the sidewalk while people watched in horror. My mother had said shh to Father when she saw me listening, but he, seeing that my interest was real and not just a child's curiosity, spoke to me of it later. Though I was still a child, we talked of the ways in which death comes and how perhaps not always, but sometimes a doctor could push death away, could hold it back, or at the very least, make it come easily. I had forgotten that part. Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.
And well read. The reason I ask you to read that is that you see that the character of Katie, like so many of your characters, like Jonas in The Giver, and like many others, has to come to grips with reality in life. And the adults in her life have the wisdom to let her do that. You notice even in this section, you've got somebody saying shh, and someone else saying too depressing, too hard, but that her wise father says, he recognizes that she's interested, and he knows that she will have to learn about these things sooner or later, and he lets her in on it, which is a very maturing and an advancing, and I think in a very kind of an honoring way to treat young people. And it's something that you see, as I say, in The Giver. Now, today's program is called Telling the Truth, because to me that is a distinctive feature of your books, I've always thought, and I've seen it again and again in rereading many of these books, the way you level with young people as the father does. Now, your mother you told me that your mother read to you when you were very young, and here's...
Oh, more pictures? Yes, yeah. Wearing an apron. Women don't wear aprons anymore.
She took time off from cooking to read to you, I guess.
Yeah,
Cooking.
yeah.
She was a lovely lady, wasn't she?
Yeah.
Well, here you're very young, but you mentioned that she read to you later a life-changing book.
Yes, yes.
Not this one that she had read to you when you were 8. Can you?
Okay, yes.
What was that book?
And maybe you have a picture of this, but as I mentioned, our house was filled with books, and I became a very avid, voracious reader from a very young age. But the books I read were the ones I remember fondly: Mary Poppins, not the movie, the book, and others, the Bobbsey Twins, which incidentally are terrible books. Never go back and reread them.
My sisters read them too.
Well, they're very racist, for one thing. Who knew? I mean,
that.
I didn't recognize that as a child. At any rate, now I'm 8 years old. My father has been overseas in the Pacific throughout the war. We're living in Pennsylvania. My mother's taken us back to the small town where she grew up. And I believe this was a book published for adults.
Yeah.
And it may have been, my mother may have been a member of, remember the Book of the Month
Book
Club?
of the Month Club, yes.
In which a novel would appear in the mail, and I think that's how this came to our home. And she perceived that it would be a book that would appeal to me. She thought to both of us. If I was 8, my sister was 11. In this particular house, we had separate bedrooms, side by side, and Mother sat in the hall. Our rooms were dark. She sat in the hall with the light coming down and read. My sister opted out after about 1 chapter. Boring, she said. She was 11 years old. Closed her door, went back to Cherry Ames, student nurse. That was part of it. And Mother read this book to me. It's a very adult book. I don't mean that it's salacious in any way, but the language is complex. But the character, the young boy, go back one so we can see him again.
Oh,
he
right.
looked like me, skinny, blonde, and he loved animals as I did. He has a pet fawn here. And yet they were people who lived in desperate poverty with terrible problems in their household. And well, terrible things happen in the book, including the death of this child's best friend. And now you can go ahead to the next one. And here is that funeral. My mother read this to me, and she wept, and I wept, and we were weeping for the whole world and what it contains. And I remember a section, I'd have to go back and look it up. It's the conclusion of 1 chapter. And it's speaking of the boy, and it said he was filled with hate for all death and pity for all aloneness. And I remember my mother weeping as she read that. And I didn't perceive it then, but I realized later, as I grew older, that she was weeping for herself. Her husband had been on an island in the Pacific where the war was raging, and she was feeling hate for all death and pity for all aloneness. But this was the book that changed I've often used the phrase, my literate life, that made me realize what a book could be. And I've often used this example, and I haven't described this to you, David, I don't think, but in this book, which takes place in the swampland of northwest Florida, on a desperately poor farm, there is a bear out in those swamplands that is eating their crops, attacking their animals, and every now and then the father goes out with a gun to hunt that bear, and the boy follows along. It's very frightening. One time I read an interview with the Canadian author, Robertson Davies.
Yeah.
Dead now, but a fabulous author. And he was asked something about the way you combine comedy and tragedy within the same book. And and the interviewer said, how do you do that? And Davies replied with no explanation, so I made my own. I simply send the dogs in a different direction. And to me, that means I pictured them going out with the hunting dogs to get the bear, the very scary thing out there, and you're going after it, and it's frightening. And then it becomes too scary, too frightening within the realm of a book, and so you turn the dogs in another direction. And though we don't have time to talk about the Anastasia books, that's what I do all the time in those books. There's a conversation, for example, where Anastasia confesses to her mother that she has a crush on her female gym teacher. She's in 7th grade. And they talk about it. And instead of going into a big thing about gender issues or different kinds of relationships, it turns funny. The conversation sends the dogs in a different direction. And that's what Robertson Davies, to me, was talking about. And I felt that because of having known this book and how they chased that bear throughout the book.
And you remember the book very well, and you remember your experience of having it be read to you, and you knew that it was a very sad story and was making your mother cry. And yet, it was a story that, to me, the story itself contains many of the same elements that I see in your own books, which is facing difficult things, a very painful split between generations, between the boy and his father, some reconciliation, that connection with nature.
I one time said recently to an audience, and I never said it before, it just came to me, that all books are about reconciliation.
Yeah.
And I have to think about that some more, but I think it's true.
And so it influenced it sounds as if you're saying it influenced, when you mentioned, you brought this up to me when we were talking. So it sounds as if you're saying that this book had an influence on your way of approaching the kinds of frightening and challenging experiences when you write for young people, that it sort of gives you permission to do that.
I think that influence is subliminal. I don't think about this book when I'm writing a book, but it's there. It permeates me. It became part of me when I read it. And I've sometimes used this or other books as examples to parents who are concerned because this book is depressing, or this book deals with things I don't want my child to have to read about. And to me, I think a book can be, and should be, and often is, a rehearsal for life. When you read a book like this, if you identify with the main character, as you should if a book is good. I've forgotten where I was going with that sentence. You will reading along think, how would I do in that circumstance? Yes. What would I do? How would I feel? And you incorporate that into your knowledge of yourself. And later, whatever the experience you're reading about, sooner or later in your life, you're going to encounter that experience. Mm-hmm. The death of a friend, as here. Yeah. The death of a parrot. Many children's books incorporate the death of a dog, and that's their way of beginning that process. But we begin to, as a child, reading this, go along and become part of that character, navigate that tragedy or that circumstance, and later in our own life, that will help us get through stuff.
The Winterby puzzle has that candor in the imagined double stories and in the historical reality.
Oh, this is the body that we talked about. You can't see the blonde hair there. It's on the other side of her skull.
Yeah. And I think you indicated in the book that what looks like a mask across the face is just a hairband.
Oh, I'd forgotten that part. Yes, when I keep calling her she, but when the body was found, it had half of its long blonde hair, and it had a woven strip of cloth over the eyes, as if it had been blindfolded. So that becomes part of the mystery.
Most of your young protagonists, have some kind of an affliction, something that sets them, many of them do, something that sets them apart from others. That's sometimes dangerously. There's Kira in the Giver Quartet, and
in Gathering
the
Blue.
Giver Quartet. There's the Giver, and then there is
Gathering Blue,
Messenger, and Sun. 4 books. And it's not the kind of, if you haven't read the subsequent books, it's not the kind of sequel where you just kind of go on with the same characters. They're all quite different, although many of the same characters in different times, some of the same characters come back at a different time in their lives. So it's a wonderful organic whole. But Kira is the main character in Gathering Blue, and she has a twisted leg.
She's been born with a twisted leg.
Now, Varric, the character in Enderby,
the boy.
The boy in the Enderby puzzle has a twisted back.
Yeah.
Jacob, who was the boy in he's the silent boy in The Silent Boy, has what seems to be some kind of autism, although it isn't called that. He can't speak, but the little girl regards him as a whole person and a friend of hers, even though everyone else regards him as kind of a freak. But he also is afflicted, and all of these characters, they have a feeling of being different. They are different, or they have a feeling of being different, and but they always have some kind of a power or some kind of a compensatory gift. And I wondered whether that's something. Even Anastasia Krupnik is a little different from other girls, right? And I wonder if that sense of being different, being not like everyone else, is that something that you recognize as an experience of younger people that you speak to?
That's a tough question, but I'm going to make a guess here. I know that as a child, even in elementary school, I always felt slightly different from my classmates, but I'm going to guess that every child feels that.
Right.
That's not a unique feeling. But I'm going to point out, too, that the protagonists of each of my books, whatever their differences, I always create a protagonist who has certain qualities of integrity and intelligence and curiosity. Those are the things that I think make you relate to a character, because if you're a person reading a book, you have intelligence and curiosity, and one assumes integrity as well. And so those are the things that triumph always in the end, even in the end of this book with a child dead in a bog.
When we were talking and I referred to the Winderby puzzle as being a departure from your earlier books, you said, well, actually, the book before that was an even bigger departure. And it was this book, which is published in...
Yes, and I've got a copy of that here.
Published in 2020. This is a book in verse. You got it.
Yeah,
this is a book, it's in verse, and it's about young people suffering or affected by the terrors of World War II, and it focuses on two events mainly. Two events: the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the bombing of Hiroshima. And you told me that because it came out in 2020, the tour was canceled.
Yeah.
Sort of the publicity, marketing, it kind of...
Yeah, I was supposed to take this book on the road for 7 cities in April of 2020. Cancel.
So it didn't get as much notice as it would have otherwise. But it's these true stories. It's not fiction, it's true stories and poems about those who lost. Now, I want you to look at this cover image, the audience, and you see an adult woman and a child standing looking at what appears to be the setting sun. And in that sun, can you see what's in the middle of that sun? It's a ship. It's a battleship. Now,
me and my grandmother, Honolulu, 1940, and there in the background is the Arizona.
At sea.
This is a clip I took out of a home movie shot by my father. And it wasn't until I was in my 50s, maybe 60s, that a friend who had been a submarine commander, and I showed this to him, and it was he who pointed out the Arizona in the background. And when I realized that, I was so struck by the juxtaposition of the, it's a movie, and so you can see the people moving, you can see the child laughing. And here are these people having a wonderful afternoon, and behind them on the horizon are 1,200 young men who will be dead in a matter of months. And I didn't know what to do with that. It kind of haunted me until I finally figured out how to put it together in this book.
Well, it puts together history, your personal history, greater history,
Yeah.
and story.
And can I just tell you, maybe you want to continue, but
Go ahead.
I was thinking
They
about
didn't
this
come to hear me.
earlier today. A way that makes the connections that are so important to me. I looked up there, again, using the computer, I found the personal histories of those 1,200 young men. Most of them, brief, were available. And so I chose just a very few to write about. And I chose them for various reasons. But as it happened, one that I chose here, I'm going to read you, was named James Myers. He was not, most of these young men were 17, 18 years old, young sailors. He was a little older. It said James was from Missouri. He had 2 brothers. The older boy had died in France in World War I. The youngest, out in a field bringing in the cows when a storm struck, was killed by lightning. He was 15. So James was left. He married, had 2 sons himself, but his wife died young, and the little boys, Jimmy and Gordon, went to live with their grandma in Seattle. It was the other grandma, widowed Mary Myers in Missouri, who opened the telegram with dread. I had bad luck with all my boys, she said. And that, her quotation, was what made me select that particular person. I read this old newspaper article of this poor woman in Missouri, and she said stoically, I had bad luck with all my boys, because her 3rd son was on this ship. Okay, after the book was published, I got an email. I don't know if I told you this story. And it began by saying, I'm Jimmy. He was the little boy who was orphaned when his father died on this ship. He said, I'm in my 80s now. Oh. And I'm wondering how you chose to write about my father. So, of course, I replied to him. More recently, this summer, I met a young man, very nice young man, probably in his 30s. And we were talking about books, and I mentioned this book, and I mentioned the Arizona. And he said, my father was 9 years old when his father died on the Arizona. He said, my grandfather was the chaplain, the Navy chaplain on the Arizona. And when he told me that, he started to cry. He'd never known his grandfather, but he died on that ship. So it was just another curious and very moving connection to this book. Should I tell them now about the child in Japan who wrote to me? Yes, okay.
Well, I was going to mention, this picture is in the book, and can you tell us who these 2 children are?
No, this picture is not in the book because the book didn't take photographs, unfortunately.
Oh, okay.
But this was a picture that I found when I was writing the Hiroshima section. And this little boy, Shinichi, trying to remember his last name, Tetsutani, soon 4 years old, it says, a big boy. Shinichi Tetsutani played that morning riding his red tricycle. When his parents found him, he was still gripping the handlebars. He was so proud of his red tricycle. Shin-chan, they called him. They buried him in their garden, and with him they buried his red tricycle. He had called it his friend, Tomodachi. That's the Japanese word for friend. Quite recently, I got a letter from a little girl who, I forgot to mention that I had lived in Tokyo after the war, and so hence my connection to
Your father was an army
Yeah, my father
dentist.
was an army officer, yeah.
So he was stationed there after the war.
Yeah. So this child, little girl, wrote to me and said, I go to the same school that you went to when you lived in Tokyo. Needless to say, it's now a very glitzy, expensive school. When I went there, it was post-war. Tokyo was rubble, but this school still stood. At any rate, she said, I read about the little boy on the tricycle, and here's the line I loved. She said, it gave me feelings of sadness. And she said, I made my parents, the way you can make your parents, take me to see the museum where the tricycle is. And she said, it gave me such feelings of sadness. Later, she wrote me a second time, and her first name, unusual first name, was Verity, V-E-R-I-T-Y. And she wrote me recently and said, I asked my mother to look up what the name Shinichi means, the Japanese name of this 3-year-old child. And she said, my mother found that it means truth. It has the same meaning as my name. She said, I feel a connection to him. So even as we think, oh, how sad, at the same time, there's something quite wonderful about the connections people
And you wrote
make.
back to her, didn't you? And you wrote back to her
Oh, yes.
about that,
Yeah.
about saying something about being in contact or being...
I'm sorry I didn't bring the letter that I
Yeah.
wrote back to her, but yes, I pointed out the connections that we have. And when you stood in that museum looking at that tricycle, you had a connection to that little boy. And it was later that she wrote, she said, I have more than that. I have the same name as that little boy. No.
In the translation,
Yeah.
Verity meaning
Yeah.
truth, and Shinichi
Yeah.
also meaning
Truth. Yeah, yeah.
which is the title of our program, by the way. I wanted to ask you if you would read something which is relevant here. It's in the, I find it in the back cover copy of your, of the Windaby puzzle, but it's also on your website, and that's the part about, it's this, beginning with my books.
Okay, they're quoting me here, although I've forgotten what it says. My books have varied in content and style, yet it seems that all of them deal, essentially, with the same general theme, the importance of human connections. And that's true, and that's what I was just trying to talk about, yeah.
And it comes up, it sort of runs through all of your stories, connection.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, you know, one of your gifts, I think, is for story titles. As an old headline writer, I always admire great story titles.
Titles, okay.
Yeah, because, and here's some
Wait a minute, before you go on, let me point out something. The Windaby puzzle.
Yes.
This book was first called The Windaby Child because that's what the body was called and still is called in the museum where it rests in Germany. The Windaby Child. The publisher wouldn't let me use it. Can you guess why? They said no teenager will read a book that has child in the title. And this book was intended for, you know, young adults.
Shows what publishers know. So, just to mention a number of titles. The title, as you know, I shouldn't say it, I should ask you, but to me a title is so much more, more than a label. It's really, at its best, it sort of touches the humane heart of a book. And your titles, I think, are wonderful. A Summer to Die is a wonderful title because it contains just in that phrase something tranquil and pleasant and agreeable and something rather disturbing in one phrase. And then Find a Stranger, say, comma, Find a Stranger, say goodbye. Just your second book, I think.
Yeah.
And that's about a 17-year-old girl, adopted girl, who decides to go looking for her biological parents. It's really another one, really wonderful story. But it's a great title. Find a Stranger, Say Goodbye. The Silent Boy is a beautiful title. Number of the Stars.
I'm going to interject
on.
something. The
Yeah,
Silent
interrupt.
Boy, again, the publisher made me change the title. Understandably, the rural people in Pennsylvania, knowing this boy who was mute, they called him Touched in the Head.
Touched,
They called
right.
him Touched. And that's a phrase that would have been used at that time. But the book was called The Touched Boy, and the publisher said, no, that has too many implications.
Negative implications.
Yeah,
Yeah, I suppose maybe to today's
Yeah.
readers it might have. And then Number of the Stars, and also a wonderful title, which is a phrase from Psalm 147. He calls them all by name. It's a wonderful title. And then two others, Autumn Street is a great title.
Autumn Street is an autobiographical book. I don't know if I've told you
No,
that.
I haven't read that.
Fictionalized autobiography. Myself, as a child, some tragic events in a small Pennsylvania town. And the street we lived on was actually College Street, but I changed it to Autumn Street.
Street.
Yeah,
Which has that sense of
yeah.
ordinary life, but also
As the leaves
decline.
dwindle down, it's autumn street.
So precious few. Okay, and then the last one I was going to mention is Gossamer.
Gossamer.
One word, which is also a great title.
Yeah.
Another one I haven't read, but now because I love the title, I have to get
Yeah,
the book and
yeah.
read that one. So, do your titles come to you early on,
No,
ahead of time,
I
at
always,
the end?
I write the title last.
Oh.
And sometimes it's hard to think of the best
You write it last.
title.
You
yeah.
don't know what's going
It's
to be
because
called.
I don't know what the book is about until I've written it, and then I try to incorporate.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. If you know, I mean, I know many reporters, most newspaper reporters, which I was for 33 years, they all want to be novelists, right? They want to quit this business and write novels. And some of them do. But I've heard from publishers that newspaper reporters don't usually make very good novelists because they can't start a story until they know how it's going to end. They need to have the whole story before they can begin. And
Yeah.
you can't do that, really. I mean,
Yeah,
it seems to me
yeah.
that's
It
not your
doesn't leave
style.
room for your
You have to find out
imagination.
what's going to happen before
Yeah,
you can title
yeah.
it. Well, that's wonderful. So you've also been unusually involved as an author with the artwork on your books, including the cover art. And I wanted to just show a few, and perhaps you'd talk about that. You took this picture.
No, I didn't. My grandmother was one of 4 sisters.
Oh.
And they
You
were the
didn't take
age of the, they all graduated from college around 1900. And one married a doctor, one married a lawyer, my grandmother married a banker. And the 4th one went to New York to study photography. And I've seen pictures of her smoking cigarettes and wearing trousers. At any rate, by the time I knew her, she was an old woman and very conventional, or seemed to me. But when she died, she left me her photographs. And this was one she had taken of a farm boy. No information about it. But this was such a haunting photograph that I kept it on my desk, and it was the inspiration
It
for
works
this
beautifully
book.
in the
Yeah.
book, and the boy in
Yeah.
the book never takes his hat off.
Yeah.
Has to be told to take his hat off.
Yeah.
And that's one of the kind of the mysteries about him. And then,
Oh, okay. I had done the photograph that was the cover for The Giver, the old man, using my father's old Leica. Anyhow, I mentioned that I had studied photography in graduate school. I had a darkroom, and so I had done that portrait of that man. Then the second book, I did the girl that's on the cover, and this one, Messenger, the 3rd book in that series. The main character is a boy named Matty, and he has a puppy. And so I have an old farm in Maine, and I sort of put out the word that I was looking for a boy about 14 to be a model for a photograph. And this boy called, and I hired him, paid him a little bit, and I asked if he could possibly bring a puppy, because there is a puppy in the book. And the boy makes a very difficult journey through thick forest, and he has the puppy with him. So I take this kid out in the woods with the puppy, but the puppy he brought was very large. And the photographs all ended up kind of funny, this large puppy stuffed inside his jacket. So the publisher used the boy's photograph of his face, but
his
not
face.
the puppy.
it's the same face. And then,
You must have another one coming up.
not of that one.
Okay.
I just because you had several of the boy, right? Before that you had taken of the boy with the
Oh, I took zillions.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Now, this one is a beautiful picture.
Yeah, I used to specialize in portraits of children, and this was a child I had photographed for her parents. They were Swedish, and so I had kept some of the old photographs. The parents had paid for the photographs, and off they went, and I didn't ever see them again, but I had kept this photograph. So when I wrote Number the Stars, which was set in Denmark, and the main character is a 10-year-old Scandinavian child, blonde in the book, the publisher called to ask what I wanted to, they were going to hire the illustrator to do the cover. So I sent them this photograph thinking the illustrator could use it as a reference. And they wrote back and said they'd like to use the photograph on the cover. And could I track the parents down and get permission?
Oh.
So I did that, and they laughed and they said, you'll have to call her. She's in her 20s now. The photograph was old. She now has kids who are in their 20s. She's just as beautiful as she was as a 10-year-old.
So you did contact her and got permission?
I got her permission, yeah.
Wow.
And of course, her kids had a great time in school when they pointed out to their 4th grade classmates, that's my mom.
So if you haven't read this book set in World War II, this is the first of the 2 Newbery medals that she won. The second one was the Giver, and the Newbery Medal for distinguished contribution in American children's literature is the Pulitzer Prize of children's books. And a little girl in Denmark who, with her family, helps to rescue Jewish people in the neighborhood, in her community, secrets them away on fishing boats, and they were
For those of you who don't know the history, that's actually happened in
yeah.
Denmark, that when Hitler gave the order to round up the Danish Jews, of whom there were about 7,000, these Swedish Christians took the Jews and hid them and smuggled them to Sweden, where they would be safe. So it was an amazing act of personal integrity.
Based on history, but fiction, but based on...
Yeah.
And there was wasn't there a girl that was sort of the inspiration for this that you mentioned?
Well, it was a Danish friend of mine who told me the history. She had not been part of the rescue, but I later met a woman after the book was published, and her story was so wonderful. I was sorry I hadn't known it beforehand, but here's what she told me that is not in this book or in any book. She was taken with her family at night across the water, great danger, on a fishing boat to Sweden. They were Jewish, she was 10 years old. And they arrive in Sweden, excuse me, and they're cold and hungry, and they've been seasick, because she says their clothes smell like vomit. They're taken in by a Swedish family, and their clothes are taken to a laundry, and they're given clean clothes. And the next day, her father goes to pick up their own clothes from the laundry, and when he brings them back, they find that all their pockets have candy in them, pieces of candy. It's just a wonderful little piece of history, yeah.
Wonderful detail. Well, I wanted to talk about what many of us are thinking about these days, which is kind of what's happening to children's books and to children's authors and to librarians in some places in the country. And it might surprise you, what it did me when I first heard of it, that The Giver was a controversial book when it was first published.
Yeah, it was one of the 10 most challenged books in the United States.
In the ALA list. And I remember asking you one time years ago, it has no violence, it has no sex, it doesn't have any coarse language. What is it about that book that bothers people? Now, you do have a sense of it.
Well, the only thing I could figure out was that it gave some parents a sense of unease because it portrays a 12-year-old boy who perceives the hypocrisy of his parents' generation and who fights against it and breaks the rules in order to do so. That makes some parents uncomfortable.
He has a strong moral sense, as many of your characters do, an innate moral sense that it is not the little girl in Number of the Stars gets it from her parents, as Katie does from her father, the doctor, but very often the moral sense is not coming from the adults. Oftentimes it's coming up in them against adult authority, and this is something that can be bothersome.
I may be jumping the gun, and maybe we're running out of time, but I came across, before I came here, he had asked me to bring some letters with me that I've gotten from fans over the years. And I found one that I'd forgotten. And this is a letter from me replying to such a question. And it dated 1994. And this was a class of 6th graders who wrote to me objecting because in this book, I'd forgotten this, there's a bad word, okay? What do you call it when somebody swears? Uses a curse word. Okay, and they want to know why I did that. And so I'll jump over the first paragraphs, but here's what I wrote them, and this still holds true, so this is really an answer to your question. If any of you hope to be writers when you grow up, then this is particularly important for you. A writer's job is to reflect reality. That's what I did when I wrote Number the Stars. I made up the story part, but I was recreating real people and events and times. There are all different kinds of people in the world and in books. If the writer made them all the same, then it would be a dull, not very meaningful piece of writing. So as a writer, I try very hard to create individual characters, and they talk, act, and think the way they would if they were real people. Some of the people in the book, for example, were Nazis. I'm not a Nazi, and neither are you, but it is okay, it's more than okay, it's important to read about Nazis because it is the way you learn about right and wrong, about good and evil. And if someone in a book uses a curse word, it doesn't mean that I do or that you do or that either of us should. It means that a particular book character speaks that way for a particular reason. There's nothing wrong with reading that. It teaches you a great deal about life, and it teaches you things of value that you can't learn any other way. You said in your letter that I should put children's values before literature. Human values, not just children's, are the most important thing in the world to me. Everything I write reflects that. The book Number the Stars is about integrity and honor. You can't learn about those things unless you know also that their opposites exist. It's my job as a writer to present all of those things in the best and most appropriate way for young people. So. Nonetheless, they've still removed The Giver from the schools in Florida.
And Lois sent me an email recently in which which included a letter that just to show that it's not always mild opposition. Someone wrote her a letter. She said she pulled from her file, and I wrote it down. And quote, this is what it said: "Your story, The Giver, is a sickening and twisted tale, obviously derived by someone with very deep issues. To say that this book is suitable for your readers is an offense against children. I have perused your website and have concluded that based on several of your book topics, you must be somewhat disturbed. We will be vigilant in watching for assignments that may include reading any of your books. I hope you get some help." Well, we all need help, but here we are in Banned Books Week, and this shows us how serious this is. I mean, we laugh, but this is a very serious business. We have not had the kind of attacks here that we've had in other places, although I do know, Linda, you told me that one of the librarians in the Old Colony Library Network did get a threat. And it's made all of us involved with teaching and writing and reading and libraries think hard about the importance of preserving these things. And I just wondered, maybe you've answered this question already, but I wondered if you could just give us your view of the importance of the freedom to write, to publish, to read, to teach, and to share, as in what libraries do. The importance of this. Why does all this matter? In 2 or 3 short words.
My husband and I were, just before the pandemic, we took a trip around Germany, and we had a guide showing us around Berlin, and there was this square where in 1936, with bands playing, they built a bonfire, and thousands of people cheered while they burned thousands of books. But the interesting thing is that we observed, our guide was a teacher in the schools in Germany. He did this as a volunteer thing. He said every year on the anniversary of that date, they line up, many of them teachers, and they take turns at a microphone reading from the books that were burned that day. The Germans government takes very seriously their history and what they've learned from it. And we should have learned the same thing.
I've kept you. I know I've kept you a long time, longer than we thought, but I just to kind of conclude, a few weeks ago, you were sending me some pictures, some of the ones we used, and you included one. You said, I just realized, I looked down and I realized I'm wearing a T-shirt. I haven't got I'm not using the picture of the T-shirt, but and she said, and I seem to be in good company. So I got another picture of the T-shirt.
Yeah.
And If you look up there to the right, the black
Yeah,
cover, you can
there's
see
the giver.
you can see the giver between the color purple and the kite runner. And there you are up there with Huckleberry Finn and Bridge to Terabithia and A Wrinkle in Time and To Kill a Mockingbird, all books that have been challenged at one time or another. So I think I can speak for both of us when I say that you are in very good company and you'll be staying on our shelves. Thank you very much, Lois. We appreciate your time.
You haven't yet mentioned the new book.
Sheesh. The author has to be involved with the marketing, I have to tell you.
I know.
She's not ready for the old writer's home yet.
Yes. This is coming out in April, and it has an odd title, which I will just explain, and then we'll quit. But it's 3 nouns, and I see they've put a period at the end of each one. When you reach my age and you go to the doctor, they test your cognition by saying, I'm going to say 3 words, and then a little later, I want you to say them back to me. And so this main character is an 11-year-old girl, and her best friend is her 89-year-old next-door neighbor, whose cognition is beginning to fail. And so the child tries to prepare her for this test by telling her each word, think of a little personal story about it. And as the woman does so and tells her the story from her childhood in Poland of a tree, a table, and a book, the child learns a great deal that she hadn't anticipated. Yeah.
Well, I think I can speak for all of us when I say, Lois, thank you so much for spending the last hour and a half with us and the last 46 years.
Let me just say one thing, that when you're a writer, your life is very isolated. It's necessary to be that way. You sit alone in a room writing. And it's wonderful to be with a group of people who share your interests. It's been really, I feel as though we're all sitting in a living room having a cup of tea together. It's been very nice.
So, if it's okay with you, a few questions?
Yeah, that's
We
fine.
have time for a few questions.
If you have to leave, please feel free to go.
We won't be offended. And our sturdy, our capable staff, armed with microphones, Linda's got one. If there are any questions. We'll let...
It is an amazing pleasure to meet you. I'm a teacher in Braintree, and if I could, when I get your autograph on the book, if I could get a selfie to show my students, they would be pretty excited.
You know what?
A bit of reverberation.
The audience could hear you, and we couldn't. Can somebody?
Okay, I can just repeat it like if I'm loud. I'm a teacher in middle school, and I'm thrilled to meet you. It is beyond a pleasure. I've been teaching for almost 20 years. I would love, when I come to get my book signed by you, if I could take a selfie so I could bring it home and show
Sure.
my students.
Thank you. Thank you for asking. Feel free to take a picture while your book is being signed.
There's one in the back there, Linda. Oh, Anna, this one.
I don't need a mic. I'm wondering if you were surprised by the success of The Giver. You've written so much, but obviously The Giver is at another level. When you were writing it, were you thinking, this is the one?
No. You know, if it's like the centipede. If he thinks about his legs, he can't walk anymore. You can't think that way. When you have to immerse yourself in the book itself. No, and that's such a. It's not an arbitrary decision, but the Newbery Medal is something that's chosen by 20 people on a particular day. If 20 other people met the next week, it would be a different book. So.
No, it wouldn't.
Wrong? But no, that never enters my mind.
Okay, I think I see some.
I have one quick
Sort of.
When you mentioned the yearling was so important to you, the thing that spoke to me was that your mother read that to you, and you could discuss that with her. That seems very important to me. Is it to you?
You're absolutely right, that bond, and it's like the bond here between these two people. I'm remembering, and I'm sorry I didn't bring it with me to read to you, an email back and forth I had with a child who wrote to me and said, I found this book, one of the Anastasia books, offensive. You should not write something like that for children. And I wrote back and said, what are you talking about? There's nothing offensive in that book. And we went back and forth that way. But finally she said, you know what I mean. It talks about a girl having a crush on another girl. You should not I know things like that happen in life, but you should not mention it in a book for children. So I said, in the book, the child tells her mother that she has a crush on a female teacher, and the mother reassures her that this is normal and blah, blah, blah. And I said, I think it just shows that you can talk about these things with your mother, which is what you're discussing. And she wrote back and she said, nonetheless, I hate this book and do not, and I signed my email with love, Lois Lowry. She said, I do not want to hear from you again, and never with love. But I was simply trying to make the point that you're making, that the bond between a parent, not necessarily a mother, or an adult, a trusted adult, and a child through the means of a book is such an important thing.
All right. Okay, maybe one more? All right.
So you have a lot of books that have a lot of different topics and
Yep.
themes.
Okay, go ahead. Start again. The mic was not on. Go ahead.
So you have a lot of books that are on different topics and themes, and my question is, do you keep a notebook of ideas that you just jot down over the years as you come across ideas for future books, potential
Okay,
books?
we're getting this reverberation. So you have to use your loud voice too.
Yes.
Your outdoor voice.
Lose
Use your
your
outdoor
grown-up
voice.
voice, please.
Your books are on a whole bunch of different topics. Do you have a journal that you keep, that you jot down ideas when you come across them for future books that you might write?
You know, I envy people who do that. And I love reading other people's journals. You know, Steinbeck had his journal that goes on for pages and pages. I don't. I wish I did. I sometimes start to, and then it just sort of dwindles away. So no, and I'm sure at my age I have probably wonderful ideas and I don't remember them the next day. But if they're really wonderful, I will, right? I will remember them, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again, Lois.
Thank you.
A wonderful day.
Okay.
Thank you for your questions.